Welcome to the Mo podcast.
A place where individual stories come to life.
This is how we need to be communicating with people. This is how we support people's personal development.
It's important to speak about people believing in people.
The more you're able to let go of your limitation, the more you step into your power, your inner authentic power.
Mo, a place for me, others, everyone. So welcome back everybody to the Mo Foundation podcast. I am so excited to have a wonderful guest and friend of mine on the podcast today, Katrina Weller. So I've known Katrina since, we were about, toddling around at playgroup. And I've been there for her sort of evolution as a human being. And I'm really, really, really keen to kind of hear and share her story with the rest of the Mo community. She is a Mo coach. She qualified a little while back in Australia, although she is from the UK, and I'm just super, super excited to have her on. So welcome, Katrina.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and to share my deep, dark secrets with everybody.
That's what we like on Mo. That's what we like on the Mo podcast. So Gina, I don't really know where to begin, but I think it would be really interesting for the community to hear a little bit about what's brought you to where you are now. And that's a really broad question, I know.
It's a very big question. A lot has happened in my 29 years of life. So I guess, as you mentioned at the start, I do currently live in Melbourne, Australia, but I am from the Midlands in England, and I moved to Australia 4.5 years ago with my now fiance. And we absolutely love it here. But my life did start in England. So I am one of three. I have an older brother and sister. And I guess the pivotal moment for me that kind of led me towards this path is when I was 15 years old. On the 7th of July 2010, my mum died. My mum, Greta, died from cancer. It was, as anybody can imagine, losing a parent at a young age was really life-changing for me. It changed my perspective on who I was, on the world, on what it meant to be a human. And I had to sort of navigate grief and figure out what and how I wanted my life to look over the next, foreseeable future. So it really changed who I was. I had always been a very shy, quiet person. I didn't really say boo to a goose, and I wouldn't speak in class. I had my very small group of friends, and I was happy with that. But once my mum died, I started to rebel a little bit and started to test those boundaries. I started to question, well, what's the point in all of this? Does it really matter if I say or act in a certain way? Because at the end of the day, we're all going to die. Sounds a bit morbid saying it like that, but I guess in reality, that is the truth. Mm-hmm. And so for the next sort of 8 years of my life, I went down this path that was quite dark, and I was engaging in really risky behaviors. I didn't understand grief and the impact that it was having on me, and that actually what I was feeling was completely normal. And in my mind, I thought that I was just strange or going crazy, and it's not something that we're ever taught about growing up. So I felt very isolated and alone in my experience. So for the next 8 years, I kind of went on that path, moved away to college, then I went to uni and studied zoology, but I continued engaging in very risky behaviors. At the end of my final year of my university degree, my sister fell pregnant with twins, which was a very exciting time and very scary for me at the prospect that it means that I may have twins one day. She fell pregnant with twins, and sadly, she went into labour 15 and a half weeks premature, which meant that both my niece and nephew were born very, very early. They were very, very tiny. And unfortunately, my nephew Matty died at 5 days old from sepsis. And this was another pivotal moment for me as I watched my sister balance between the duality of life and the duality of grief, because she was there happy that she had her daughter, my niece, who was still, very much high risk but alive, and she was happy because she was a mother, but also the deep grief and sadness because she had lost her son as well. So it was this duality of emotions that made me realize that we don't have to just feel one thing, and it's not as simple as that, and that there is a complexity to our emotions and to life. And I started to really re-examine my own choices and the way that I had been living for the last 8 years after my mum died. And I realised that I was living in this space where I felt that the only way to honour my mum was to be angry and to be sad, because that's the only way to show that I was grieving. It's the only way to show that I cared and that I missed her, which I now know isn't true. So after that, I really went on a journey of, I was seeing a psychologist, I was speaking to friends, and I was starting to remove myself from those risky environments that I had put myself in. And I started working in schools, and I was doing a lot of work whilst I was finishing my degree in schools, in primary school. And I realized I actually love working with kids. And although I also love working with animals, and they're not too dissimilar, I actually just really loved working with kids. And for me, I felt that that was more of a career path that I was drawn to. And so I started working in schools. I was also working at a vet. So I was kind of doing a bit of both and dipping my toe in both. And then I managed to get a career working with disadvantaged students across the Midlands and doing aspiration raising workshops, both one-on-one and to groups of up to like 200 students. And I absolutely loved it. So when I met my partner and we decided to move to Australia, I managed to get a job combining those two passions at an aquarium, which was incredible, where I did education pieces, etc., etc. Again, working with children and working with animals. And then when COVID hit, we all lost our jobs. And I was left wondering, what on earth am I going to do with my time? And I'd always wanted to speak a lot more about my grief. In more recent years, I'd had a lot of friends reach out to me when they experienced a loss, because more of my friends were starting to experience that as we got sort of into our mid-20s. And I realised how many people felt alone and isolated just the same way that I did. And I wanted to change that. And so I started a podcast called Grow with Grief in 2020, which I absolutely loved. I actually had you on, which you'll remember. And I spoke to all different types of people that had experienced all different forms of loss. Because for me, what I realised is that so often when we think of grief, we think of death and we think of bereavement. There's so many other forms of grief that are out there in the world. And so often people feel alone in it because it's not acknowledged as grief, when in fact that's what it is. And so I started bringing people on to share their story so that they felt validated and other people could also resonate. And from there, I started doing workshops. I started getting invited to do guest speaking. And this is when I decided I really actually want to help people on a more personal level. I knew that from sharing on social media, it was having an impact to me, sharing my experience. Not only was it helping others, but it was actually helping me to be able to finally give a voice to the things that I had experienced in my life. Was really, really powerful and healing for me. So I decided in the middle of lockdowns, what can I do? And I heard about Mo through you. And I decided to do a coaching course. And it really enlightened me into how I can work with not just adults, but young people as well. And how can I not be a counsellor and not be a psychologist, but be able to provide support if these topics come up in discussion. And so now what I do is actually run an educational organisation where we work with schools and we run in-class workshops based around navigating change. And I work one-to-one with children. I also work in classroom settings. I do development for staff. I also do corporate workshops. And so I have a blended approach in terms of coaching, but also evidence-based practice. I'm also almost about to finish my counselling diploma. So I've blended all of it together so that I can best serve young people. And that's what my passion really is working with young people so that when change does happen in their life, they don't need to run from it or be afraid of it. They can move through it and walk alongside the change without fearing it. And that's my big passion now. So that's kind of how I've got to where I am now in a snapshot, I think.
I mean, it's
There's
definitely
a lot of stuff in there.
yeah. No. I mean, obviously I know a huge amount about your life because it's I've been a part of it. But it's amazing to hear you kind of go through that process of where you were and kind of where you are now. So with the work that you're doing, what do you call yourself? What's your title?
I say I'm a grief specialist. And the reason I use the word specialist instead of expert or something like that is because I don't think anyone's ever an expert in grief. I think that, it can crop up at any time. It doesn't matter how much grief you've experienced. If a new form of grief comes into your life and you experience a new loss, it's going to hit you completely differently. So a grief specialist and an educator is what I call myself.
What a beautiful title. And so needed in today. And it's exactly what you were saying about that kind of grief being showing up in all sorts of different places. So we think of it in if we're very binary with it, it is of somebody who's passed away and therefore you grieve it. But it does. It shows up in all sorts of walks of life. Losing, I don't know, I've just moved house even. So, losing that community, losing that stability of a place that was home is now not home. And the sort of complexity around that. So it's really fascinating. And also young people are going through it at 1,000,000 miles an hour because everything is changing.
Mixed grief and hormones together, and it is honestly it's a whirlwind. And so when they're trying to understand what's happening to their bodies, but then there's also these major changes because most of our life changes happen in those first 18 years. We start going to nursery, we start going to school, we start learning to be away from our parents and carers. We then learn about friendships and relationships. Our bodies are changing. There's so many transitions that we go through as a young person. And then add on top of that any big life things that happen, such as a bereavement or maybe a parent separation. All of these huge things that are happening in a young person's life. Mix in some hormones, and if you haven't got the education and the support there, then it is a recipe for disaster, and it is a recipe for where you get to that point that I was in, where you're engaging in those risky behaviours and you're feeling isolated and alone and misunderstood. So this is why it's so important that we talk to young people around what grief actually is, but also how do we navigate those emotions and how do we move through them and talk about them, and how do we communicate with others about the way that we're feeling in a way that's safe, not just for us, but for other people as well.
Yeah. And a key word that keeps cropping up there is that isolation that you felt. And as you say, I'm sure lots of people kind of feel in their grief because it's so different for everybody, and it's such a personal thing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of how to make it a little bit less isolating.
For other people, to make it less isolating for other people, I would say is, first of all, listen to what they have to say. I think so often when it comes to grief, the thing that makes you feel so isolated is that everybody's trying to fix it, right? So they're saying it will get better after a year, buck up, be strong, they wouldn't want you to be sad, all of these things that actually just make you feel more and more invalidated, when all you want to do is talk about your person, is to sit there and have a cry and somebody not judge you for it or make you feel that it's wrong to feel those emotions, but then also on the flip side, validate when somebody isn't feeling sad or angry. And let them be happy and let them have moments of joy, because there's so much guilt placed on a person often if you are seen to be laughing or having a good time too soon after somebody's passed away or after a big loss. So the biggest thing so that people don't feel isolated is actually just sit with them in whatever they're feeling and don't try and fix. There's so many platitudes out there and myths around how we should express our grief, but understanding that grief is so individual and so unique to each person, and every time they experience grief it's going to feel different. Personal example, when my mum died, the grief that I experienced is very different to the grief that I experienced when my granddad recently died. But then on top of that, we've been struggling with infertility and I've experienced multiple miscarriages, and the grief that I've experienced there, it's been a whole new learning curve. And just because you've experienced grief once doesn't mean that you know how it should go. And just because you've experienced it personally doesn't mean that you know how it should go for somebody else. So removing yourself and having a very unbiased, non-judgmental approach, and just hearing somebody and sit with them in it, as opposed to trying to fix everything. That's something that we like to do as humans. I think we like to try and find answers. Sometimes there doesn't need to be an answer. Sometimes it can just be crap.
Yeah. And it makes me think about the kind of the world of coaching, and when you're sitting with a client and actually just them having someone there to listen to them whilst they work it out themselves, which is, what the Mo course does beautifully, is so healing and so validating, to use your words. So yeah, no, I think that's a really, really lovely thing to do. And it's great because I think we, as humans, like you say, we like to have this kind of a formula almost to say, oh, well, this happens, this is how you deal with it. And emotional things are just much more nuanced and complex than that. So yeah, dealing with the human psyche, dealing with, I imagine that grief kind of latches on to everything, your whole understanding of the world, your whole understanding of yourself. So yeah, it's going to shake you and move you in ways that you just don't imagine or anticipate. So yeah, no,
I often refer to it as looking through, in those kaleidoscopes where everything kind of is everywhere. There's different colours everywhere, and you can't quite make sense of it. That's what it's a little bit like for me, anyway, in terms of grief, because the colours are so much more vivid. You're so much more aware of everything, and you're so much more aware of the small things and the importance of those small things in the world. And you notice the things that maybe you didn't notice before, and also the things that seemed so big before don't seem as significant anymore. So I often think that it's kind of like looking through a kaleidoscope. And just another thing on making sure that people don't feel isolated so often as well is that I hear from grievers that they don't want to talk about it because they can see the other person's uncomfortable. So, as a coach, what can you do to show that you're not uncomfortable sitting with them in that? If you can tell that somebody is like sort of writhing away from it, maybe they've got their arms crossed, maybe they just kind of, just their whole body language changes, you're not going to want to talk about it, and that's going to make them feel even more isolated and alone and less likely to speak to somebody else as well. So as a coach, it's really important that we can make sure that we're showing that we're comfortable and getting used to being comfortable in that discomfort with others.
Yeah. It's that that idea of holding one's own, isn't it? And being able to just let it wash over. It's gonna, I'm sure, I mean, grief has a way of, I was talking about sort of latching on to things, but it does, when it's in the room, it becomes something quite uncomfortable. And what would be your advice in sort of alleviating discomfort, if you had anything? Obviously, it's very...
so if you're a coach and you feel uncomfortable?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing.
I think that you have to be really honest with yourself if you are going to work with somebody or support somebody that has experienced, especially like a significant loss. I think you have to be really honest with yourself of, can I sit in this? Do I feel able to sit in this? Do I feel able to make that other person feel validated without putting my own perspective, without putting my own discomfort on them, and really be self-reflective on it? Obviously, the more you talk about it, the easier it becomes, and it becomes less uncomfortable. So educate yourself. There's so many books and podcasts and social media pages and blogs. There's so much information out there about grief. Go and educate yourself so that when people do come to you and talk about it, if you want to be able to provide that support for somebody who is experiencing loss, that you know, and you're not sort of taken off guard, and you have a very realistic approach to it because you've heard people sharing their real life experience, not just what's written in sort of like a counseling psychological textbook where it's all theories. That's great, but actually hear from people, listen to podcasts, read books, and hear their first-hand experience, because all the answers are there. They're all there. And reflect on your own moments in time where maybe you've experienced a loss, and perhaps it's not a bereavement, but maybe it is those transitions that you've gone through, moving jobs or new friendships where you felt uncomfortable, and reflect, what would have made me feel less alone in that moment. So I think the only way you can feel more comfortable is through self-reflection.
Well, that's a really, really lovely way to put it. And it's so right with these, I'm obviously studying at the moment, and I think the theories and everything, they're very rich and they're very interesting, and they do kind of make you think about what's going on for yourself anyway, but they really do underpin the reality of the world. They're not the answer. They're there to support. They're there to inform how we show up in the world, and there to be a kind of human being on top of that theory is really what we're striving for, I suppose. I mean, it sort of brings me into my next question, which was really about when you're not feeling great. So, as a coach, sometimes we show up to an environment, we might be grieving ourselves, we might be going through things. So I'd just love to hear from you how you've navigated that, and some tips and tricks for our community, maybe.
It's been a big learning curve, and I think I still am learning, if I'm completely honest. At the start, when I first started working with people in this space, I definitely, I'm so passionate about it that I took too much on. And there is such a thing as vicarious trauma, where you're taking on other people's emotions and the things that they've experienced, burnout, for example. And, when I was doing my podcast, I was doing a podcast that it felt like recording a podcast a day. And I realized that was not sustainable because it was exhausting for me to be present with somebody and hear all of these sad, heartbreaking things. I was so grateful that I was in that space and they were so vulnerable with me, but also it's a lot of energy that you're giving. And then it also brings up a lot of your own grief, right? That may or may not be present and you may or may not have worked through. And so what I realized first and foremost is that I need to maintain good boundaries. So I can't, the only way I can help the world is if I do it piece by piece. I don't have to do it all at once. And so really making sure that I have that time in between to do the things that I need to do that refill my cup. Also being aware of dates and times that may be quite heavy and exhausting for me, around anniversaries, significant days, that kind of thing, making sure I'm keeping my workload quite light around those times. And then more recently, with infertility, miscarriages has been a whole new thing that has thrown my life into a bit of chaos. And it's quite challenging because I'm a business owner and I have bookings and I have clients that I have to show up for. And so there is an element sometimes of, in the morning I wake up and I may not feel great, but what can I do to just get myself out of bed and get myself there so I can give 100% of what I've got that day. It may not be what I deem to be 100% of my quality, but if it's, if I'm working at 60% and I give the full 60%, then I feel like I've done my client justice. So sometimes it is a case when you are self-employed and you've got this business to run that you have to kind of push through. But then what can I do when I get home and in the times where I do have the downtime to look after myself? So for me, it's things that like walking my dogs, or sometimes it is just mindlessly zoning out and watching something terrible on TV. Sometimes it's baking that makes me feel really close to my mum. And so it's finding all of these little things that keep me going. And, and then sometimes there has been moments where I've just had to say, I can't. I can't. It wouldn't be safe for me. It wouldn't be safe for my clients for me to be there today and to do that work today. And that's something that has been a real challenge for me to have to accept. But it's something that I'm very transparent about with my clients in terms of if I need to take the time, I will take the time. And I think that's a really good role modeling to show that it's okay to have boundaries and it's okay to put those things in place. So yeah, boundaries, finding the things that help you, and also sometimes just taking the time off. You sometimes just have to.
Yeah. And I think it's a real cultural shift, I think, since, I suppose, something that I've noticed since the pandemic, and the older generation saying, the young people don't want to work and things like that. But I really do believe that actually we're just valuing our time a bit better, and we're sort of going, do we have to be working our nose to the grindstone, and I think that's the phrase, and do we have to be killing ourselves in order to survive, or is there another way? And I think that's a really exciting time to be in the kind of workspace, because we're questioning those things, and I think something that you said just before we jumped on the podcast was this idea that, or this notion that we don't have to have it all together all the time. It's so true and so rich with, it's just, we don't have to have it together all the time. We're human beings. We are fallible. And
exactly. And I definitely think there is a sense of, in a community, not necessarily just in the coaching community, but I think if you're working in a space where you are serving people, is that sense of almost like imposter syndrome if you don't have it all together. And I definitely felt that earlier this year of how am I working with people and telling them, different ways of navigating change, and it's okay to feel all this stuff when I'm pushing my own stuff down, and that's not authentic, it's not real, and it didn't feel aligned. And that's when I realized, well, that's because I'm putting this image out there. I'm saying to people it's okay to not have it all together, and then I'm pretending to have it all together. And so it didn't match up. So I think it's okay to show that you're human, and we all have these peaks and troughs in our lives. And sometimes we need to ask for help. Sometimes we just collapse in bed and we're like, nope, can't do it. That's it, give up. And then there's other times where, you can pull yourself out and you can go for it. And it's finding what works for you. I've found that I am not a person that can work till 3 a.m. Whereas I've got friends who absolutely bossing it and absolutely love working till 3 a.m. and absolutely they love the grind. And that's just not for me. And I think it's finding that balance of what works for you. I also have ADHD, inattentive ADHD. And so that's another thing that I've got to factor in. And it really comes down to what works best for you, so that you're not burning yourself out. Because as the age-old saying goes, is you can't pour from an empty cup. And it is so true. It sounds very cliche, but it is true. You have to be able to find the things that work for you. Don't follow what everybody else says. You can try it, but if it doesn't work for you, that's okay. You'll find something that does.
You're not a failure if something that works for someone else doesn't work for you. That's a really nice
like 5 a.m. club, no thank you. Tried it, no.
I tried it this past year as well, and I must say the time that I gained back, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I get home from the gym and I was like, oh, I'm actually up and about and I'm ready. But then by about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I was done for. That was it. I was
exactly.
So yeah, as you say, it's finding the balance, it's finding what works. Yeah, so funny. And just on that, so something that I've been, really blown away by is, you were just talking about the sort of image that you put out, and you have really jumped on social media as something that you use to kind of, yeah, I saw you sort of grimace there. Our listeners
I'm
can't
not
see our
fully
faces, but
consistent with my socials. My socials are, again, a peak and trough that come with my ADHD fixations, and so you tend to find that you can kind of see how I'm going in life generally when it's reflected in my social media presence and consistency.
okay.
But
Because
I
do
do love.
as someone that consumes it, I don't necessarily notice when it's not there. I don't notice when there's lots of it. It's for me, as someone that just witnesses it, it seems like there's just a constant stream, and that you're really kind of on top of it. So yeah, it's amazing how you feel and how it's then perceived.
Oh yeah, and look, with social media, you have to, like, nobody's going to notice if you don't post for 5 days. They're really not. It's all
No.
about what's in your mind. But I love social media. I think it's a really great tool for expressing yourself, but also B, connecting with so many other people. I've made so many friends through social media, especially in the grief space, and to be able to hear their perspectives and see how they talk about their own experience, to make friends who have a similar experience to what I had. It's a place really that has made me feel less isolated, especially when it comes again to this infertility stuff. It's not spoken about a lot. And the place where I found the most comfort and solace is social media. It's people sharing their experiences of it, the things that they've tried, the things that they've done, and how it's going for them. I think it's a everything has a yin and a yang, and I think social media can have a beautiful support. And you're supporting people that you might even not know that you're supporting them. I get messages all the time from people I've never met that have said they've been following me since 2020 when I did my podcast, which I don't do anymore. I've not done it for years. And they're still there. And I think how beautiful, you will never know the lives that you've impacted just by hopping online and sharing. And at first it's really awkward. And then I actually find it really easy now. It's almost like a diary for me to share everything that I'm feeling in a day. And that's everything from laughing down the camera and doing a silly dance to bawling my eyes out, probably a bit of snot coming out my nose, doing a reel on me, like, falling apart. But it shows, again, that I don't have it all together. And I think that's what makes it so beautiful. And that's why people resonate with it, because they're like, oh my God, she's a human. She's not just a robot, she's a human.
Yeah, because there is the tendency online that we put out these filtered appearances, we put out these I suppose idolized versions of ourselves and what we want the world to see. I write poetry about it often, and it is that kind of the projection of what we want the world to see, and hiding the. I'm just looking out my window, and little Robin's just stopped outside the window, which interestingly is talking about grief, is a totem of my grandmother. So that was a bit of a tangent gone off there. But she just popped to say hello and grace us with her presence and say, oh, hey there. So what was I saying? Social media. I think it's a really, really interesting space when used correctly. And like, as you say, kind of showing up when you're not feeling so good as well is a really, really good thing to do. I think I was inspired by you recently, and I put up an honesty post and said, honesty post, things are going a bit rubbish for me at the moment, because you look at my social media profile and you see these beautiful nature walks where I'm out with my dog and I'm, living life to the fullest. And what people don't know is that actually everything's falling apart and you're struggling to make it through, and you want to show up for people, you want to be able to I don't know, be the best version of yourself, but sometimes you are just human. You are just a human being, and just making whatever sense we can make of this life. It's fascinating.
I think
Little
as well
Robin's
when it
still
comes
there,
to
sorry.
it's still there.
Yeah.
Cute. I think as well when it comes to social media, one thing that I'm really careful of as well is just making sure that what I'm sharing is trauma informed and safe, because I do see a
Yeah.
lot, and I do want to mention this because I do see a lot of posts and content that is quite sort of toxic positivity. I know that term's thrown around a lot, but I do think that there is a bit of toxic positivity out there. People kind of just trauma dumping online, and that's not what it is at all. It's got to be, yes, authentic and real and feel aligned to who you are, but at the same time making sure that you're doing it in a safe way that's safe for you, but also safe for other people who may be consuming that content. Because especially when it comes to grief, right, it's such a complex response that we have as humans, and there's so many layers to it, and so you can't just put blanket statements out there or give diagnoses or whatever it is that you're talking about. And I think that that's something that you just have to bear in mind when you are sharing content on social media: is, are you doing this safely? What are the reasons that I'm doing this as well? Am I sharing online for validation? Am I sharing online so that other people praise me? Or am I doing this because it genuinely, I don't care if anybody sees this or not. I don't care if 100 people see it or just one person sees it. All that matters to me is if the one person hears what I say and they think, oh my God, I'm feeling that too. Or, oh my God, that must be what my friend's feeling, and now I can go and support them. So there's a bit of a caveat there, and that's what I mean about the yin and the yang of social media. Is you got to be really careful, but it is such a powerful tool, and I think that so much positivity can come from it, and so much impact can come from it, especially as a coach.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's really interesting what he's just said there about the almost the intention behind why you're posting, and yeah, it's a fascinating one. And I think for me it was just this feeling like everyone had it together, and I went, I'm going to show maybe that I don't have it together. And then the response that you get when you kind of do put yourself out there and show a little bit of vulnerability is breathtaking. I had so many people from my past sort of reach out like, I'm also going through such and such. I'm also this is also something that I'm struggling with, or whatever. And it's that's the power. I really saw the power come to life with that. And I suppose podcasts are another sort of layer of that. It's listening to people having honest conversations as human beings, and then the listeners, all you lovely listeners out there, are here to listen and resonate with what resonates, and go, oh, okay, I'm not alone, and therefore I've got this. And I've noticed that the Mo podcast, actually, through listening to some of them, I've learned so much. I've learned so many little tips and tricks along the way, and it's it's fascinating being able to share one's voice, and share one's story, I suppose. Yeah. So we've talked about grief on a kind of very personal level. I'm really, really interested on a global level, because we've all just been through the pandemic. I say just, it's been a few years now, but I think we're still reeling from that a little bit. And people may not want to admit that anything changed, but I think a lot has changed. So I'd love to hear your reflections, and we have touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to hear your reflections on that. So grief on a global scale.
I think everybody felt this loss of safety and security and autonomy. We were thrown into this world that we never thought we would be thrown into. We kind of lived in our blissful naivety of, we get to choose when we wake up, when we go outside, what we do when we go to work, how we spend our days. And that was sort of taken from us, and in a way that, I think people grieved that freedom that maybe they felt they didn't have anymore. And we felt it all across the world, regardless of what your circumstances were and where you were living in the world, because obviously every different country experienced it differently. And we're only just really starting to see the impacts of that, and especially in children and in schools, the impacts of your we call them preps here, so going from into reception, and then into year one, these children we're starting to see the impacts that it had, and a lot of them are really anxious about change, because this mass change happened that could not be ignored, but nobody knew how to deal with it, nobody knew how to navigate it, and actually I think in some ways everybody going through it on a global scale, it meant that these conversations were more open to being had. People were more open to talking about grief because they could resonate with it, and they could actually identify with it, because you could give them a scenario that everybody had experienced. There's not one person on this planet that doesn't know about COVID. So, you can make it, really relatable to people. And that meant that the conversation opened up a lot more. But I think there's such a complexity there, because there's so many, everybody's life was impacted so differently that grief that was felt, we're not really going to see the impacts of for another 5-10 years. We're starting to see it through schools now, but it's really difficult. But at the same time, I do think it opened up a really great opportunity for, most of the best grief podcasts and grief specialists out there that I know of came about during COVID, because people were more willing to hear it. And it's that thing of, if someone resonates with it, they're more likely to talk about it. So it's really hard. I'm not too sure what more else I can say on it, other than the fact that I actually think it's opened up that conversation more, which is only a good thing.
It is. I mean, it is a really, really good thing. I just had a thought on the, I suppose I was linking it back to your story that you shared right at the beginning. So the fact that when you were, faced with the huge loss of, losing your mom, it didn't really hit you, or it hit you in a way that you weren't able to look at to begin with. It was almost like a shock, and it also made me think of the when people think about grief, when people think about grief, they think about the 5 stages. And I know that that's something that you kind of through your work have been looking at dismantling, or rewording, rehashing, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I know it's something that ruffles a few feathers in the grief community.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think anyone in the grief community would. Well, I think that most people are on the same page with me on this. So, the 5 stages of grief, which was written by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, it was research that she actually did on terminally ill patients, so people that were facing their own impending death. And she herself has said that these 5 stages were never intended to be used as a prescription for grief. They were never intended to be used as a stage-by-stage linear model, but somewhere along the way, it has evolved to become this crutch that people use as well. I have to feel one of these 5 emotions, and depending on which one I feel shows where I am in my grief and at what point this grief is going to end. But sadly, when it comes to grief doesn't end. I always say that grief is lifelong. It's something that we learn to live alongside. It's going to come in and out of our life. It ebbs and flows. There's going to be months where maybe you don't think about it, and then something happens. Maybe it's the smell of a perfume or just an advert you see on TV. There was a McDonald's advert that was on for a while, and it was a mother and a daughter, and every time that came on, I just bawled my eyes out. And so there's these little things that make it resurface, and when it does resurface, it feels just as heavy as that first day of loss. That first day when you found out that they died, or someone was separating, or that loss was happening, it resurfaces. And so you don't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're done. The other thing is that I do think there is a space for it, because a lot of people find comfort in it, right? As I said at the start, people like to have answers, they like to have structure. And so sometimes what the 5 stages of grief or any other theories around grief can do, it can provide a bit of a model for people so that they feel in control. And that can help reduce anxieties, it can help reduce fear. And I don't think that's a bad thing. If it helps somebody and it resonates with them, then that's great. But I think where the dangers come with the 5 stages of grief or any other grief theory is where we are too rigid with it, and we're like, it has to be this way, it has to look like this, because it doesn't account for all those different nuances, as we mentioned at the start, and the uniqueness to grief. We know that it doesn't follow a pattern. If it followed a pattern, I wouldn't need a job, because we'd all know what we're doing. So, it's so complex. So things like the 5 stages of grief, I'm really passionate about talking to people about actually the truth behind the theory and how the theory came to be.
Yeah.
So you have the context there, but then also saying and normalizing that it's okay if you don't feel those things, and showcasing all the different theories that are out there, because there's a lot of different theories out there. Yeah. Which one's right? How can you say which one's right if there's multiple out there? You've just got to find what resonates and works for you. So that's what I'm really passionate about. And especially when it comes to working with young people and children, it's so different as well because of developmental stages. So, they're still developing, and the way that we talk about grief, the way we approach grief, the way that we respond to grief is so different for anybody under the age of 18 to what it is as an adult. And so I think there needs to be education around that. Yes, 5 stages of grief. I don't mind it, but I think it needs to be used appropriately.
Yeah, no, I hear that, and I think it's what we were saying earlier on, isn't it? It's the trying to make something that is so complex less complex and more digestible, more palatable, because, well, to use your example, when you're looking into a kaleidoscope, it's really difficult to make sense of that. And what we're trying to do there, or I suppose what the aim of people that are looking into that kaleidoscope is how can I make this black and white? How can I put words to this, or make sense of this, or not get so lost in the fragments that are coming thick and fast, because it does, it sort of shatters everything that you've known, and has a lasting impact.
It's giving people, when you're working with anybody that's experienced loss, it's giving them the opportunity to make their own meaning from it. And when I say meaning, I don't mean you have to find meaning in the reason that something awful happened. If there was a traumatic event or a death, you don't have to find a reason that happened. There doesn't have to be a reason, but finding meaning moving forward. So how are you going to keep that connection alive? How are you going to take what you've learned from this experience and then continue moving through life and putting one foot in front of the other? And that doesn't mean doing something big. It doesn't mean starting a business like I did. It doesn't mean talking on podcasts and sharing your story openly. You don't have to share it with anyone if you don't want to. But it can be as simple as, okay, I used to always light a candle on Christmas Eve with my person before they died, and so I'm going to continue doing that. It could be, I'm actually just going to keep getting out of bed every single day, and that's my meaning making. So it's supporting somebody to find their own way forward and not placing your expectations of what it should look like. And I know, as coaches, we're not meant to place our expectations, but it can be really hard when maybe there's a situation that resonates with us and we can see that somebody's in pain and we just want to be able to fix it for them, recognizing we can't fix it. And we have to just sit with them and allow them to to find their own way forward. Of course, we can hold their hand, we can stabilize them, but we cannot create the path for them. They have to find that themselves. And that's something that, once I realized that for myself, that really changed everything for me, because for a very long time I just wanted everybody else to tell me what to do. What am I meant to do? Where am I meant to go? How am I meant to navigate this? I don't understand. Nobody around me understood either, because nobody around me had lost a parent at a young age. And so I just kind of felt like I was grasping at things that everybody else was doing and not actually finding I was following everybody else's path, not my own. And until I found my own was I able to do what I'm doing now, where I'm really living in my passion and what I'm excited about and what gets me up every single day. So yeah, finding your own meaning is really important.
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful way to put it. I think it's a lot of what we've talked about obviously is going to resonate with the community having lost Darren this year. So I think what you were talking about there, and the kind of meaning making and not the rationale, not the why and all of that, but the making meaning, or how do we carry on the legacy, is something that's been really alive for me. I'm currently using Darren's microphone to do the podcast, so we're continuing these conversations. And something that I did in my own grief, I suppose, is I wrote a poem, and it was a way for me to make sense of what was happening and what had happened, and how it really felt for me, because there were no words, but I kept having this really strong image, and the poem starts, this grief feels like an inky black pen submerged in a crystal clear glass of water. And it's all about that. Yeah, things have changed, things are different, and the path, as you put it, is not clear. It's not defined. I think I was writing recently as well about a path in the shrubbery, and it is that, how do you find a path, and how do you carve out the path for yourself, when all you want really is someone to scoop you up and save you, look after you and say, here, I've laid it all out for you. So there's a real strength to the navigation. And actually what you've said with your work in helping people and sitting alongside people in their grief, or sitting alongside your grief itself, is just incredibly powerful work, incredibly powerful. So yeah, I'm really interested in how we use things. And I know that a lot of the work that you do with children, you use things like, I don't want to say you simplify it, but you give a language for sometimes things that are without language.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to children, as I say, you have to be really age appropriate and developmentally appropriate. And so I wouldn't just go into a class of grade ones and start talking about death. And people dying, right? Because they're still developing their actual understanding of the fact that humans die. So unless they've experienced the death of somebody close to them, often they can only relate death to stuff that happens to animals and plants. So when we're talking about loss, we often talk about change as a broad term, and then we introduce the concept of death through plants and animals, because that's an easier concept for them to understand. And we talk about how change can make us feel, and how who can we ask for support from when things change, and how can we support ourselves when things change. And so we use storytelling as a way of painting that image for them, and then it's very child-led, so they will often come forward with their own experiences of grief and loss that they've experienced, and they may not be able to term it as grief and loss. We don't use those words grief with them. We just talk about change and how that makes us feel, and the big emotions it might make us feel. And again, that duality of sometimes it might make us feel happy, sometimes it might make us feel frustrated or anxious. And then as we move into the older years, of course, then we start to get more specific. But it is really about simplifying it, using concrete language as well. So if you're talking to a child about death, use the word dead and died. Don't say they've gone to sleep or they've gone away for a while, because that can actually create fear and confusion, and children like to have clear concrete language so they can understand. And so getting comfortable with using those terms, dead and died, it can feel really blunt at the start, but I always say my mum died. Like, I'm just used to it now, I say it, whereas before I probably would have said, oh, she passed away. But to a child that doesn't necessarily mean much. So using clear concrete language, and we like to use a lot of arts, so a lot of things where they can use their hands, so it gets them out of their it removes the pressure of having those conversations around big emotions, and it means that they can express themselves freely through movement, through music, through painting and arts. We do all of these different things that when we're working with children, to actually sit and just have a one-on-one conversation, you're probably not going to get much from them. And I know that from personal experience as a 15-year-old, when I went to see a counsellor after my mum died. First time, I think I'd probably gone to see her about 6 times, and I just spoke about stuff going on at school. And then there was one time where we made a memory jar, and this is something I still do with my kids now in my workshops, because I love the activity so much. We made a memory jar, and that's the first time I spoke about my mum in the session. And I think that's because it took me out of that logical part of my brain, and I was doing something with my hands, and it didn't feel so confronting. And so that's what the kind of things that we utilize when working with children. And the other thing is that often children, as adults, we experience all our emotions at once, and we're like, yes, we need to work through this now, we need to solve it. We've got a lot more life experience, we kind of just try and get through. But with children, they'll it's called puddle jumping, so they'll jump in and out of the emotion of what they're feeling. It's actually really psychologically safe, but so often as adults we think they're just avoiding it, they don't want to talk about it, they're not facing what's happened.
Oh, it's completely different kettle of fish, isn't it? It's
a completely
very,
different
very
kettle of fish.
different.
Their brain is still developing, their poor little brains are still developing, and it's actually protecting them so that they're not overwhelmed by emotion, by learning, by trauma, whatever it is. It's almost like dosing it for them so that they have the time to be able to make sense, because grief does change our pathways in our brain. It changes our neurological pathways. There's a lot of research around it. Grief brain is a real thing, because there's all sorts of, I won't go into the science of it, but there's all sorts of stuff going on in our brains and in our pathways, in our blood vessels when we're grieving. And so it's actually really safe. And so if you are working with children that have experienced loss, just remember those things, that it looks very different for them as to what it does for an adult.
Yeah. And it's fascinating what you say about kind of using the arts to create this kind of third prong, because as our listeners probably know, I'm training as an arts psychotherapist, but that's for adults as well. It's sometimes safer to create a bit of distance, so put it in an image. How does I suppose I was using language earlier in the inky black pen, and how does it look, how does it feel, how can we give meaning to it. And I think I would strongly encourage, if any of our listeners out there are kind of struggling with big emotions, it might not be, oh, I need to talk to someone. Obviously that's great, and it's the first port of call if you're feeling low, but if you don't have that resource straight away, grab a piece of paper, grab a pen, dance. I know that you put on a favourite tune of yours sometimes that reminds you of your mum, and dance around and like you say, feel the joy of it, feel the push and pull of the emotions that can coexist. I think that's a really strong message, is that they can exist together. We don't have to feel just sad, we don't have to feel just whatever we feel, they're constantly sort of in motion within us. So yeah, that's really fascinating, and it's making my brain tingle with all the all the different avenues and things that we've discussed today. So Trina, we're getting towards the end of the podcast, but
We
I
could just talk
just
for hours,
wondered.
couldn't we?
We could talk for hours and hours. Our listeners may not want that, but I think what we've covered today has been really interesting. And I'm just really grateful to have you on the podcast. Is there anything that you would like to share as kind of a final note?
I suppose that grief feels lonely, but you're not alone. And you don't have to feel any certain way if you're grieving. Every emotion, every feeling is completely valid and normal. Grief is a very normal response to a significant loss. And what is significant to you may not be significant to others, and vice versa, but it is to you. And it is a uniquely personal experience. And so if you are feeling alone, if you are feeling confused, if you are feeling unsure or uncertain, then find one person, whether that is a psychologist, whether that's following someone on social media that is sharing their experience, whether that's listening to a podcast. Do it, because I guarantee you will hear something and you will think, oh my gosh, I feel that too. And you will feel just a small part of you will feel finally acknowledged. And that small acknowledgement, it doesn't have to be a big thing, but that small tiny bit of acknowledgement really can make the difference in grief. And I think sometimes, especially with me sharing on social media, people think that I have it all figured out with my grief. And I'm telling you now, it's 14 years, coming up to 14 years this year in 2024, since my mum died. And I still sometimes do not understand why I'm feeling and why I'm feeling it. And I am in the midst of my own grief with infertility, and I do not understand it sometimes. And I think there's this idea that you can't have that you have to be strong all the time. I don't believe that. I think that true strength comes from actually acknowledging how you're feeling and saying, I need help. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how, I'm going to move through this. This is scary. This is unknown. And that is the real strength. So don't be afraid to ask for help, and know that you're not alone. And if you do want to talk to anybody who, gets grief, I only touched on a brief part of my story today, but I've experienced a lot of grief in my 29 years on this planet. And I'm always happy to give a listening ear or refer to somebody who, might have a similar experience. So that was a little bit more than just a little bit of an ending.
It's lovely.
But just know it feels lonely, but you truly are not alone.
Yeah. That's so nice. Thank you. And for anyone listening, we will pop down some resources. Gina, what's your handle on Instagram and your business name? I don't think we've even covered that.
Well, so Instagram, 2 pages. So there's Grow with Grief, which is all grief-related resources and education and free downloadables, etc. And then there's also my personal page, which is Katrina Weller _ and that's where I'm sharing more about the work that I do, my own personal experiences with grief and loss at the moment, and what it's like to run your own business and all of those fun things. And you get to see a couple of videos of my cute little 2 rescue dogs as well. So that's always a bonus.
That's beautiful. So as I say, I will add all of those resources and some more if you are feeling like you just need someone to talk to, then we can refer you. So thank you so much for coming on today, Trina, and I look forward to seeing what's next for you.
Nice to speak to you. Thank you.
Bye. And that concludes this episode. Thank you so much, Katrina, for coming on and sharing your wisdoms. I have a feeling that this will be an incredibly cathartic and needed podcast for the community, as we all grieve in our own way, no right or wrong way, the passing of Darren. And as we all move through different phases of our lives, which bring all sorts of different changes, this is a reminder to go gently and reach out for that support if you do need it. Now, if you are interested in sharing your voice and your story on the Mo podcast, then please do get in touch with one of the team. You can email myself at Maisie@mofoundation.com or Jane@mofoundation.com. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about Mo and what we get up to, then you can find out all of that information on our website. That's mofoundation.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Now, this is a message for anybody who thinks that life coaching might be the right calling for you, but you're not sure how to attract new clients. So on the 17th of April, we will be having our next Mo Digital Academy. Keely Vuong White, the founder of Kia Ora Coaching, is going to be talking to us about how to attract clients as a new life coach, a 90-minute long introduction to marketing. Now, she's had a fantastic life and has spent 15 years in international corporate marketing and has also learned a thing or two about setting up a business. And she's also done her coaching with the Mo Foundation. So she's going to be running a fantastic workshop. We hope to see you there. If you're interested and you'd like to register, then please find more information on our website. That's mofoundation.com/calendar. Thanks so much, and we will see you there.